Hey everybody. It is starting to snow here. We've had quite the week of winter storms, and you can't see me, but I'm saying winter storms in quotation marks because in Portland it takes, all of about an inch to completely shut us down. My kids didn't have school on Wednesday, and I swear by noon all of the snow was melted, so it felt a little bit ridiculous to have a snow day without any snow. But needless to say, it's been a bit of a weird week, so we are looking forward to the weekend. So let's get started talking about sense of belonging. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's what my scholarship has focused on, and I love to talk about it and explore the research in this area. So I'm excited to be the one to get to share with you guys today. Just as in other sessions, I want to show you, real quick before we dive into the slides, you should have the files that I've shared with you. As in the previous sessions, the materials we're going to go over today, the PowerPoint slides, obviously, and the facilitator guide that accompanies those. If you have that in front of you, you might notice I've done a little bit of tweaking. We found that when we present each of these, having written these several months ago before we actually were given the task of presenting the material, things have shifted a little bit in our thinking, and we found ways that it makes a little bit more sense to talk about them. So if the slides look a little bit different today, not to worry. We are tracking all those changes, and we will share the updated materials with you at the end of this project. But in addition to the facilitator guide and the PowerPoint slides that you should have, you should also have in your files 2 separate teacher's guides for the 2 belonging interventions I'm going to talk about today. Our goals today are to define sense of belonging and get a good sense of how we think about this in an academic context, and also be able to talk about and explain the importance, the research on why belonging is so critical for academic success in math, and then have a good understanding of how to apply some actionable strategies to promote sense of belonging in the math classroom. In your facilitator guide, we have included a Icebreaker activity, and the purpose of this activity is probably kind of obvious since we're talking about belonging, but the whole goal here is to help people find connections with one another. And this is an activity that you could tweak to make work if you're working with a group of teachers that already know each other quite well versus people that are rather more strangers to each other. But in this activity, what was instructed is for small groups to get together and find some time with a little bit of chit-chat where they can come up with either some of the most interesting things about each other that they all have in common, or other topics that they have in common. And then the goal here is, of course, not only to make those connections and find common ground, but then practice introducing the rest of the group mates to the others in the larger group. And this is just an activity that we use not only to break the ice and get people started feeling connected with each other, but also to kind of set the stage that teachers, one of the more critical things that teachers can do is help build a sense of community and belonging in their classrooms by asking these kinds of simple questions about their students' lives and finding connection via things that they have in common. And that can be, as simple as we both enjoy baseball or we both have a golden retriever. But there is research to show that when we work to find common ground with our students and share in those experiences, it really does help build relationships. So this activity is kind of to help start the conversation and help think about what that looks like. We want to start by coming to a definition of what belonging is. And there are many ways to describe and define this, and it's kind of a funny thing to define since, as human beings, we all know and have a good sense of what belonging feels like and is. But for the purposes of our work together today, the definition we're going to use is feeling like an accepted, respected, valued, and legitimate group member. And what's really important to stress in that definition is the feeling like part. Because we want to really stress here that belonging is very subjective. People decide themselves whether they feel like they belong or not. And so what I mean when I say subjective is as opposed to you might have an objective perception that a student seems very connected. Perhaps they are a member of a lot of clubs and organizations, and when you see them in the lunchroom, they have lots of friends and people they're sitting with. But that doesn't mean that person may not still be struggling with feeling a painful lack of belonging. So we let people define belonging for themselves, and it's that subjective feeling like they are accepted in the group. Belonging matters because we are, at our core, inherently social creatures, and we have a strong and fundamental need to form and maintain positive connections with other people. And it's really important when we think about belonging to distinguish between what is a need and what is a want. Now, one way to think about a need and a want is to think about the difference in, let's say, nourishing, healthy, balanced diet versus that delicious piece of chocolate that someone brought to the lunchroom. Now, you could go without the chocolate even though it would make you a little bit sad, but you definitely need to have a healthy, nourishing diet. The difference here is that the failure to satisfy a want might be disappointing in the short term, but when we fail to satisfy those basic needs, like the need for nutrition, like the need for belonging, it leads to severe distress and negative long-term consequences. Research suggests, and psychologists have theorized, that we actually have evolved this need to belong because our connection to other members of our group was so critical to survival for our species. And what this means is that we're hardwired for connection with other people. Our brains are literally wired in ways that make us seek out and try and maintain our connections to other people. And although people might differ in the quantity of connections they want, some people, are a really people person, they want lots and lots of close friendships, others can get by with just one or two. What connects us and makes us all similar is that we really do need to have those strong bonds with other people. And this is really striking when you go to review the research on belonging. These results about the critical need for belonging and the dire consequences when those needs aren't met, they are replicated again and again across different age groups, across different cultures, and across time. And this research has shown, because belonging is so fundamental, we're really well attuned, whether it's conscious or not, to our belonging status. So even though when you're not aware of it, we are scanning our environment to pick up on cues that we might be at risk of not belonging. So when I talk about cues to belonging, maybe what comes to mind is the time you receive the silent treatment from your partner or friend, and you can really relive how painful it is to have that experience. But that's a really extreme signal about belonging. I think what's really interesting here is that we pick up on even much more subtle cues, things as simple as when someone doesn't give you much eye contact in a conversation. And even those very subtle cues can impact our sense of belonging and connection with another person. And experiencing exclusion, feeling rejected, having a lack of belonging is intensely painful and can have serious psychological consequences and also, I think, some really surprising health consequences. So this slide summarizes what some of the research shows us here, and we know from psychological research that when people feel rejected or excluded, they feel sadness and anger, decreased sense of self-esteem. Those probably aren't that surprising to you. There's also research to suggest that when people are feeling excluded, that they have impaired ability to self-regulate, and they even have poorer cognitive functioning. On the physical side, research shows us that there is good reason to believe that our experience of social pain being rejection and exclusion, we actually experience that in the same brain systems where we feel physical pain, but those are overlapping experiences. So when we talk about, the heart is breaking, we use similar words to talk about physical pain and social pain, which is really interesting. We also know that loneliness is as high a health risk as things like smoking, drinking, and obesity. So again, just trying to drive home the point here that belonging isn't some kind of feel-good, nice-to-have quantity, but rather it's really critical. It's something that we need to thrive as humans. Now, belonging can be tied to specific contexts. So a person can have a distinct sense of belonging within a school, but also within a particular class or subject area and within a particular friend group. We also know that people can experience a sense of belonging with their larger social categories, such as their gender, their race or ethnicity, and also their sexual identity. So belonging is continually negotiated across each of those different contexts. Talking about belonging brings up the concept of identity. These things are closely related. Identification, really what identification is about is perceiving your membership within a group as important and self-defining. And this can refer both to kinds of social categories, but also specific domains. So my identification as a woman, my identification as a professional, my identification as a psychologist. Those are all parts of my identity because they are important to me and also help define the self. The difference here between belonging and identity is that belonging is feeling a connection to those larger groups, while in contrast, identification is the importance that we place on being a member of those groups. But these two things are clearly really closely related. And while belonging is distinct in many ways from identity, belonging may be an important part of math identity because the way students think about themselves in relation to mathematics and the extent to which they develop a commitment to, are engaged in, and see value in mathematics is all going to be related to the extent to which they feel like a legitimate member in the math classroom. So at this point in a training, it would be a good time to let some of those definitions and more foundational parts of the research on belonging sink in and make it a little bit more personal. So we have described in the facilitator's guide what we call a belonging brainstorm to get people to spend some time thinking about their own experiences around belonging and think about positive experiences around belonging in addition to negative experiences about belonging, and take some time to reflect on that and then discuss with some group members. So here's one activity I'll describe that you could use to do that. And this we usually use posters to display or put up around the room some of these bigger questions about belonging. So these are questions like, think about a time when you experienced a sense of belonging in a group. How did you know that you belonged? Or think about a time when you struggled to feel that you belonged in a group. What happened? And then what we do is we divide the group up into as many small groups as there are posters and have them move to one of the posters. And then the small groups take some turns writing down the answers to the question for each of the individuals in their group. After everyone has had a chance to respond, you swap posters, that is, and have the small groups rotate to the next poster and reflect on that question. After they've had enough time to answer the second question, have groups go back to their previous poster and then read what the other group member wrote down. And then reflect on what's been added and highlight or circle any comments or representative things that really stood out for them. And then bring everybody back into a large group and have the small groups acting with a spokesperson, have them take a minute to summarize for the larger group what stood out about the answers to their specific question. Now this is an activity that can often require some intimacy. We find that when people talk about belonging, particularly about a time that they struggle to feel a sense of belonging, everybody can think of a time that in their past that was pretty painful for them and a time they didn't feel like they belonged. So this is an activity you want to do with a fair bit of safety in your group members and make sure that people feel safe sharing. Because it doesn't matter if it happened when you were 12 years old or 15 years old, we've all had that one time we felt really rejected, and I think the pain of those can come up quite strong. But after this kind of activity, getting people to think about and reflect on their experiences, then you want to bring the larger group back and debrief the activity by connecting it again, connecting people's experiences with the experiences of children in the classroom. So this could be done with some key questions such as, how do you think belonging, identity, and exclusion affect how children learn in the classroom? And also questions that have people come up with examples where they've seen these things at play in their own classroom. So questions about, have you seen the effects of belonging or exclusion impacting students in your own classroom? Think about a time you witnessed someone else struggle to feel like they belonged in a group. What happened? And this is a really nice way to kind of ground the research that we go through here in personal experience, but also what people have experienced and witnessed in their own classrooms with the children that they work with. All right, after, I should say, in regards to that activity, all those key questions that I just described are in your facilitator's guide for having a large group discussion about this belonging brainstorm after the activity wraps up. Next up, we transition into talking about situating the research on belonging, specifically in the classroom and how it relates to students' ability to learn. And so I want to connect back here to the Farrington model that we've talked about in each of the different presentations in this training series. And recall that Camille Farrington's review, what the point of this review did was collate all of the research on academic mindsets and make a model of how academic mindsets are related to academic outcomes, achievement, test scores. And what this research overview found was that really it seems that academic mindsets are promoting the kinds of academic behaviors that ultimately support achievement. And of the academic mindsets in this research review that the Farrington model distills down as critical, there are 4. And the first of these is I belong in this community, the mindset that I belong here. And of course, this is sense of belonging that we're talking about today. We know, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, that belonging is important for everyone. From, I don't care how old you are, from birth to 99, belonging matters for us all. But we also know that belonging can be especially important in certain situations for children and youth. Sense of belonging is complex, and there are some really complex social relationships that children have to navigate at school that make it especially so. We know that social relationships are grounded in norms and biases that are the result of our culture and environment. So we are negotiating that belonging in a really complex way for kids that have to negotiate those different cultures and environments when they move from their home life to their school life to their peer groups. And as I mentioned earlier, we are constantly monitoring our belonging status. But that's particularly so in points of life where we are particularly vulnerable to threats to belonging. And there's a couple of key places where people tend to be more vulnerable to threats to their belonging that I want to talk about in the context of students in the classroom. First, we know early adolescence, sense of belonging may be particularly vulnerable as they're negotiating that time in their lives where they're becoming increasingly independent from their parents and developing their identity as separate from their family unit. And they're also negotiating new peer groups and relationships in new and complicated ways. We also know that times of transition are places that make us particularly vulnerable. So the transition, for instance, when we start at a new school or even a new grade or a new class, these times of transition make us more vulnerable because our old social ties are sometimes falling away and new ones are being negotiated. And what seems to be unique about these times of transition is they really just lead us to be questioning again and again, do I belong here? Is this a place where I am welcome? Is this a place where I'm safe? And this is the case for all individuals, but we also know that belonging is particularly important and particularly at risk for young people that have marginalized identities. And we're going to spend some more time talking about that in a moment. Now, just as I reviewed earlier that general belonging is linked to more positive outcomes, we also know from a wealth of research that kids' sense of belonging in schools is also linked to better academic outcomes, both in terms of their health and their academics. And this slide presents just a few of the outcomes that we know are associated with belonging. For instance, on the health side, we know that kids that report higher school belonging are less likely to abuse substances, decreased early sexual initiation, decreased violence, suicidal ideation, and even disordered eating. On the flip side, we know school belonging promotes some academic outcomes that we care about, like self-efficacy, motivation. Kids that feel strong belonging in their schools attend at higher rates. They also show higher persistence and even higher achievement. But because of that whole laundry list of belonging promoting the good things we care about and decreasing the likelihood of the negative things we hope to avoid, we think of belonging as kind of a psychological hub. It's at the center of the wheel, promoting all of these really important things like persistence, performance, interest, health. And this is easy to understand, right? If you are not feeling like you belong, it's really difficult to be fully engaged and motivated and interested and persist. So this sense of belonging as a hub is an idea we return to a lot. And because belonging facilitates all of these important things, we often view it as a really critical starting point for educators that want to improve their students' experience in the classroom. Now, the reason belonging seems to be so tightly linked to these important outcomes is that because, as I talked about earlier, we are always monitoring our belonging status. And when we are concerned about belonging, when we're asking that question, do I belong here, precious mental energy is just getting sapped, and we have fewer resources left over to concentrate on important things. And what I want to talk about now is this kind of reciprocal cycle that we see that tends to be really problematic when people are in this frame of mind of questioning their belonging status. So when we feel more uncertain about our belonging, we're more vigilant to cues about our belonging. We're picking up on more things that we would normally let go if we weren't feeling uncertain. So these are things that, like just normal events, like a classmate who didn't say hi in the hallway, the teacher who didn't call on you in class, a bad grade on a math quiz. These are all kind of normal everyday events, but when a student is questioning their belonging, they get interpreted in the worst possible light. So for instance, that classmate that didn't say hi, it's because everyone at the school hates me and I don't belong here. The reason I call this a cycle is because that just feeds into even greater uncertainty. And this whole cycle just keeps going round and round. On the flip side, though, of course, when someone feels more positive about their belonging, they're less attentive to those cues. They will let things roll off their back a little bit more readily. And cues that they do pick up on, they're more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt as opposed to interpreting them in the worst possible light, which just further bolsters belonging and promotes resiliency. So coming from a place of vigilance versus that place of giving stuff the benefit of the doubt can create very different perceptions of the exact same environment. And I think this is an important idea to explore, because often we wonder, the kid that's struggling and it seems lonely, doesn't have a lot of friends, we wonder, well, why don't they just act differently? Why don't they act in ways that would be more likely to get more relationships? But I want to show you here, kind of thinking through why that's the case. So if we think back to that example of a classmate who doesn't say hi in the hallway, and think about how coming from these two different frames of reference might impact our interpretation of the event and then also our responses. So for the student that isn't sure about their belonging, like I said earlier, that gets interpreted in the worst possible light. Nobody here likes me. On the other hand, for a student that does belong, they can explain that away in a more adaptive response. It was just loud in the hallway. That wasn't really about me personally. And these two different interpretations of the exact same situation can lead to very different behavior. On the one hand, if you assume no one at the school likes me, well then you're likely to just withdraw effort towards building relationships. On the other hand, if you give it this more low-stakes interpretation, it was just loud in the hallway, it wasn't a big deal, then the response that leads to might be, I'm going to be more direct next time when it's loud. The difference in this perspective can be it's subtle, but I think it's important to think about. And it can be a challenge, I think, sometimes for adults who may be aware of the importance of belonging, but are often coming from a different perspective than students. I think adults often feel a little bit more secure in their belonging than some of the students we encounter do. And so, for instance, it might be you cancel a meeting with a student, and that carries no hidden meaning for you, and you just assume the student is going to understand that you're busy. But to the student who's worrying about belonging, it might feel like you just don't like them and don't want them in class. So it's important to think about how things that don't seem like that big of a deal can be interpreted differently depending on your frame of reference. All right, let's bring this back to math here. I've kind of lost the thread of thinking about math. But as we talked about, when we talked about anxiety and growth mindset, thinking about these factors in a multidimensional space. Because we know, sense of belonging, it's not just about our social connections, it's also about our connections with domains more broadly. So we ask questions, do I belong here? And that's getting at our sense of our relationships with our peers. But we also know students ask questions, do I belong here, towards a domain itself. So those are questions not just do I fit in here socially, but do I fit in here intellectually? Is this a place where people like me get it? So if we consider the multidimensional nature of belonging, it's really important to draw that back to our conversation about math. A student may feel like an outsider in math, even if they have a strong sense of connection with their peers in their math class. On the other hand, a student could feel like he or she, I'm really a math person, but still have trouble connecting with their classmates in the math class. These two aspects of belonging, the intellectual side and the social side, they can interact, but both are important. And just as we talked about earlier how concerns about social belonging can affect social behavior in ways that kind of reinforce those negative patterns, that cycle we talked about, we also see that concerns about intellectual belonging can also negatively affect academic behavior in ways that further threaten belonging. So if we think back to the example of a student who got a bad grade on a math quiz, and how that might lead to different interpretations and responses for students who are more or less sure about their belonging in math. So for instance, for the student that's not quite sure about their belonging in math, they get that bad grade on a math quiz. Well, again, this is going to be interpreted in a more negative light. And the interpretation in this case might be, I'm just not cut out for math. It just isn't for me. Or on the flip side, a student that feels strongly connected with strongly connected with math, their interpretation instead might be, oh, I got a bad grade on that quiz. I need to study more or differently in the future. And those two interpretations are going to lead to different responses. Assuming that the interpretation is, I'm just not cut out for math, and it makes sense that that student might just avoid math and withdraw. Or on the flip side, interpreting a bad grade from a place of confidence and assuming, okay, I got a bad grade, but I need to study more, that might lead to a more positive response, like asking and reaching out to the teacher for study tips. So this slide is going to look familiar to you, and I just want to remind you that we have included some of the same content across each of these sessions because we intend for them to be modular in nature, that you should be able to take this belonging session and give it to a group of teachers who haven't seen any of the other training sessions and not worry about the important content getting missed. So you've seen these before. We repeated them on purpose. We think it's really important to think about that multidimensional nature of belonging in math and talking about math as a domain specifically because we know that there are stereotypes about who belongs in math. And so these are the first 5 images that came up on a Google search for math genius. We talked about these images at our very first kickoff meeting, and we noticed that there are some strong cues that these images transmit about who belongs in math. And this is, I think, a pretty visual demonstration of some of the stereotypes that our society captures and carries about who we expect to belong in the math classroom. And tying this back to our conversation that we've threaded throughout these training sessions about gender and equity in math, we think that these stereotypes are important because they really do seem to be playing a big role in the gender gaps that we see in math and STEM participation more broadly. That girls in particular have this twofold stereotype that they must contend with, that math is something that men and boys do, and girls are less able than boys at math. And these two things together seem to interplay in ways that just continue to make the gender gaps in STEM persist. The good news, of course, is that counteracting stereotypes in effortful ways can increase the interest in STEM of girls and students of color by bolstering their confidence and bolstering their sense of belonging, that this is a place that they can belong and succeed. Now, we want to talk for a second about belonging and equity. This is a slide that we've given in your facilitator's guide. There's lots of notes to walk through this because we think this is a really important concept. When we talk about disparities within education, we rarely talk about gaps in belonging. We're much more likely to use language that focuses on structural inequalities, discrimination, achievement gaps, opportunity gaps, all focusing on the ultimate end goal of achievement on standardized tests. Now, math, of course, is one place where we know achievement gaps are most evident. And we agree, and as I'm sure you do, that as educators and people interested in promoting the success of all students, it's really important to address structural disparities in education. However, it's often, we believe it's a mistake to think that the only way to address educational inequality is by tackling these really systemic factors directly. Indeed, given how hard it is to change structural inequality directly, focusing only on that first piece would virtually ensure that our progress is very slow and little is done in time to help students who are in school today. On the flip side, on a more positive note, we know that sense of belonging is something that also is within our power to change and within our power to change on a quicker time frame. these kinds of structural inequalities and discrimination not only affect achievement gaps, but also affect students' sense of belonging. And in some ways, we can think of the kinds of experiences students have in schools when they have a marginalized identity, when they look around their campus and see no one that looks like them, or they confront stereotypes about their intellectual inferiority on a daily basis, that really they're entering a place that denies them that strong sense of belonging. What's problematic about this is that we know everyone's questioning, do I belong here? But those questions become that much more impactful because they become more about the group. Do I belong here? Do people like me belong here? Am I safe? Now, we like to think about targeting sense of belonging as a way to promote making progress toward evening up achievement gaps as an in-the-meantime solution. That, as I said before, of course, tackling structural inequality and discrimination is a very important goal, but also one that we know is going to take time. The good news is that sense of belonging is something that we can all be working at today in the classroom with very small tweaks to our practice that can help in the meantime to be working on those achievement gaps that we all worry about on a daily basis. Now, that is a really weighty conversation, and I haven't given it probably nearly enough time here, given our short time together today. But we have given you lots of key questions in the facilitator's guide to keep that conversation going with your group, and we would encourage you to give that discussion a nice long bit of time, and then afterwards a nice long break. Well, not long, 5 minutes, but giving people a little bit of mental space to process that rather weighty topic. Today we are going to keep going because we don't have that much time together, but this would be at least a 5-minute break for an in-person training. Coming back from break, we've switched our focus from reviewing the research on belonging to talking about classroom strategies and particular interventions that can be used to help promote sense of belonging in the classroom. And before launching into 2 specific strategies that we have given you teacher's guides for around belonging, we have some space here devoted to talking about the kinds of general classroom practices that research suggests can go a long way to promoting a positive sense of belonging for all students in the classroom. Because we know teachers play a really big role in creating a welcoming and inclusive environment in the classroom. And this can be achieved in really small ways, linking back to our conversation earlier about the really kinds of subtle cues that convey a sense of belonging. There's research to show that even as simple things as making really clear eye contact and correctly pronouncing student names, these are small, but they're really powerful cues that can signal belonging to students. We've all been in that situation where someone just doesn't make much eye contact or can't be bothered to remember our name. We know how that feels. It feels as though they don't care about us and they are not invested in that relationship. Of course, the same goes for students. We also know that the physical space that students encounter can affect their sense of belonging. We've talked about this research in previous trainings as well, so I will review it briefly here. But we have talked about how physical objects in the environment that students encounter can serve as pretty powerful cues for who belongs there and signal the culture of the people that are associated with that environment. So the study we're referring to specifically here showed the impact of academic environments that did or did not possess objects consistent with stereotypes about computer scientists. And after they used these kinds of cues, they looked at students' sense of belonging and also interest in the field. And the study found that girls were more likely to feel like they belonged when they encountered a computer science classroom that didn't contain the stereotypical cues of the geeky computer scientist. When they were in a more neutral classroom, they reported feeling more like they would fit in, like they were similar to the other students, and they also reported more interest. So these kinds of subtle cues that the researchers were using to indicate the stereotype about computer scientists were as simple as computer parts being strewn about a desk, Star Trek posters, coding manuals, when instead those kinds of cues that signal who belongs, and it isn't girls and women, when those were removed and replaced with neutral objects like art and plants, the women reported more interest and more belonging. Interestingly, boys were equally interested in computer science regardless of how their classroom looked. So what this suggests is that by taking away those cues that are relevant to just a single group, that doesn't hurt the group that is linked to those cues, but rather just makes that more neutral environment inviting for everyone. Now, building relationships is a pretty obvious cue to help promote belonging in the classroom. And I think it's important to think about the different kinds of relationships that students encounter. And not only is it their relationship with their teacher, but also their relationship with their peers. And to some extent, particularly in younger students, it's a relationship between the teacher and the family at home. We know from research that when teachers and students have a stronger sense of belonging, stronger sense of similarity, it does impact students' achievement. And there's research to suggest that when teachers intentionally work on building relationships with their students and also between their students, we see improved social behaviors, students report more connectedness to school, and then even higher academic achievement. To the extent possible, research also suggests that building relationships with families can help promote belonging both for the parents and the students themselves. Now, some parents are going to enter a school or a classroom and they will see people that look like them, that speak like them, that value the same things they do, and that pretty much guarantees them to feel a stronger sense of belonging than parents who come from the two specific interventions that we have included in this training. They are what we call, first, normalizing uncertainty, and second, promoting group membership. And we're going to talk about this idea of normalizing uncertainty first. Now, when students struggle in a particular subject, they may be more likely to misperceive that struggle as an indication that they are not good at that subject and never are going to succeed. Now, even if students say they believe that everyone has the potential to be successful in math or science, this may not actually translate into beliefs about their own abilities. And that struggle when something doesn't come easy might be overinterpreted as, this just isn't for me, I just can't do this. As we talked about earlier, belonging is multidimensional. It's not only about our social connections, but it's also about the extent to which we feel like we have intellectual or ability fit in that domain. We know that one way to promote intellectual belonging, that component of belonging that isn't necessarily about peer relationships, is to normalize the experience of struggling and feeling challenged, particularly when it comes to domains like math. As we talked about throughout this training, we tend to have this stereotype that math is a gift, that if you're going to be good at math, it's just something that should come naturally to you, which I think makes us more likely to find that struggling in math can be interpreted in a much more negative light. We also know that stories can really powerfully impact people's attitudes, their beliefs, and their behaviors. And there is some emergent research to suggest that when we use stories to teach students how even accomplished scientists and scholars struggled during their own professional journeys, this can help promote a sense of belonging in math and other science fields. And it might be doing so by kind of getting at this kind of intellectual sense of belonging in a field. So in the research we want to talk about now, we found that, this research found that learning how famous scientists like Einstein struggled in math early in his life, or even how a less famous example like Einstein, an older student in one's own school, how that person overcame challenges in math, learning about the struggles of people that have come before can really reassure students that their own struggles, their own challenges in math are not insurmountable. And not only are they not insurmountable, but they're normal. They're just something that happens for everyone. And if we persist and work hard to overcome those challenges, it will pay off. So we want to tell you about an intervention researchers have developed to promote belonging by working to normalize this experience of wondering about belonging and struggling. This intervention, the goal here is to emphasize that concerns about belonging are normal for everybody, and they are likely to fade with time. So what we're trying to do in this intervention is impart this kind of two-part message. I've been there too, and it gets better. And we call this the normalizing uncertainty intervention. We think this works because it helps young people frame, when they encounter a setback or a challenge or a worry, instead of thinking about that in the most negative light, like we talked about before,
Instead, it helps frame those kinds of challenges as really something common for everybody and transitory. This is going to pass with time. Instead of interpreting those challenges as, you know what, here it is, this is the proof I've been waiting for that I don't belong in math. Excuse me. So returning to think about that cycle we talked about earlier that can kind of send people into this spiral. When we give students this more, experience where they learn how it's normal to struggle, what happens here is that those challenges, instead of being interpreted in the worst possible light, we're really helping equip them with a more adaptive interpretation of those normal challenges. This helps students understand that it's normal to encounter this, and they can reframe their own struggles. So that bad math quiz grade I got, well, it's not because I'm not cut out for math. It's if I reflect back, well, I studied with the TV on. It's not because I'm not smart enough. What we're really trying to impart here is that help students learn math is challenging for me, just like it is for everyone else. So I need to put forth my best effort and just try a different technique next time. So what seems to happen here is that we're interrupting that cycle where students interpret things in the worst possible light, which only feeds into more uncertainty. So how does this intervention work? Well, the goal here is to communicate, as I mentioned before, a two-part strategy. Worrying about belonging and struggling in school, or worrying about struggling in math, these are normal experiences for everyone, and it's going to fade with time. It's going to get better. In the first part of this intervention, students hear first-person stories from older students. So in the case of the elementary students you might be working with, you might have middle school students share their stories that convey this message. I've been there too, it got better with time. What's really important about this intervention is the authenticity of those messages. They need to be true to students' lived experiences. The first-person messages should also come from students of different background characteristics, because what we want to show here is that everybody, regardless of gender, regardless of race, they worry about their belonging and have struggled in school, specifically with math from time to time. I think that's why the struggle stories highlighting famous scientists like Einstein can be so powerful, because they show even the person that you would expect to never have any trouble, to never struggle at all, this is a normal part of everyone's experience. Now, these messages can come in many different ways, and this intervention can be tailored in ways that make it work in different settings. So you can have these first-person stories come from letters, they could be pre-recorded videos, they could even be in-person visits from older students. As long as we're getting across to our students this two-part message of it's typical to worry about belonging, it's normal to struggle, it's going to get better with time. This is a two-part intervention, as I mentioned, and the second part is for students to engage in a writing exercise, and we call this a saying is believing exercise, where they work with an imaginary pen pal, and they reflect on how this message is true in their experiences. So you ask them to think about a time you struggled with something and it got better. And the reason that this seems to be so important to have them engage in this kind of saying is believing exercise is because it helps students to see themselves as benefactors to those coming behind them, as opposed to the beneficiaries of help. This intervention appears to be beneficial because it's giving young people that more adaptive way to think about those normal social setbacks and adversities. Now, at this point in a training, I would pass out the teacher guide that has the step-by-step directions for doing this kind of intervention in the classroom, and start a discussion with how teachers would, in what they like about the intervention, but also what they see that they would need to adapt to make it useful in their setting. And then also give space and time for questions about how that intervention would play out in the classroom. If you check your teacher guide on this specific strategy, we've given some more detailed steps for being able to work through this. All right, lastly, we are running low on time here, so I want to talk about the last intervention that we've included in this session, and that is working in ways in the classroom to promote group membership. So that first intervention we talked about, normalizing uncertainty, that's really kind of targeting this experience of worrying about intellectual belonging. And this group membership interventions, these are really targeting social belonging, so building those strong peer relationships in the classroom. And there's some exciting evidence that suggests educators might be able to boost students' motivation by creating really simple classroom group identities that are tied to learning activities such as math. And we have evidence from several studies that have shown young children, even very young children like preschool age, they're not only more likely to persist, but they also perform better on math and other spatial tasks when they are primed with social cues to make them feel like they are part of a group. In a classroom setting, young children seem to perceive task-based collaborative groups to be important, even at this very young age, similar to the kinds of intimacy groups like friends or social category groups. And we know that when children develop these kind of socially shared motivations, like we do math, math is important to us, it really seems to forge a sense of common purpose and reinforce that feeling of group identity. This sense that this is who we are and this is what we do. And when we can tie that to an academic skill like math, all the better. It helps promote this kind of persistence and even problem solving. So there's lots of ways groups can be created in the classroom, such as color groups, groups with a specific purpose, even groups named after an animal. And evidence suggests that outcomes improve only if children actually identify with their group. An experimental study found that young children who completed a math or a puzzle task as part of a group persisted longer on the task, they completed more pieces of the task, they thought they were better, and they were even more interested in the task when it was connected to a social group. Now, what's interesting about this research is that they actually were not part of a social group. It was done independently. They just thought they were part of a group. So it can be that subtle and that minimal to tie academic tasks to group work, and it still seems to really promote motivation. So this research suggests that incorporating these kinds of non-academic social factors, building group membership, building group identity into teaching practice can be an effective way to boost children's math motivation. One way we've talked about doing this, and in addition to using these kinds of grouping strategies and talking about group identity, is the Jigsaw classroom method. And we've talked about this in previous sessions as a way to promote connection, and it's a good reminder to bring that up again here. This is another way to make learning or math more collaborative. And what happens in the Jigsaw classroom technique is that each student learns different content and then rotates within that space to share their knowledge with their classmates. So what seems to be really powerful here is that each student is getting to take on that expert role, and every group member is integral to the success of the whole group. So we're kind of forcing the group to work together to have a successful outcome. We've talked about how this works in previous sessions. We divide the groups into expert groups, and each expert group learns exclusively about one component of the lesson. So the example I've used here is if you had a lesson on central tendency, you divide students so that some learn about the mean, some the mode, some the median. And the next step, students regroup into home groups, and each of these home groups includes only one expert on each of the different topics. Each expert is then in charge of explaining his or her area of expertise to the rest of the home group. And in order to be able to know the whole content of the lesson on central tendency, everybody is critically important. Now, the Jigsaw classroom method has been around for, I think, probably 40 years now, and it was initially designed to reduce racial conflict. But other outcomes it's been shown to promote include social relatedness and belonging, even test performance, liking for school, and reduced absenteeism. Now, it's important to note a couple of cautions when we talk about math groups for group membership, because as we talked about earlier, children are really sensitive to social cues. So it's important when using these kinds of grouping strategies to make sure to stress that you value each group's contributions equally and avoid creating an in-group and an out-group. Associating groups with activities can increase motivation, but the danger here of associating groups with an underlying or fixed ability at those activities may instead decrease motivation. So what we're trying to get at here is making sure that we're avoiding grouping strategies like saying, you know, this group, they are the subtraction group because they are really great at subtraction, because that sets up the dichotomy. If they're good at subtraction, then I must not be. Now, just like with the normalizing uncertainty intervention, this would be a spot where we would have teachers work in small groups to process these these different tips for creating grouping strategies in the classroom, and then work through what do you like about this, what would you have to adapt to make it useful, how would you actually use this in your practice, and what questions do you have for your group mates about how this could be made easier to implement in your strategies in your classroom. This would also be a good place to this is a place where people might already have some strong ideas and some practices that they're already using. So I would probably spend some time asking, giving people a place to share with each other additional strategies that they have used or seen others use to promote belonging and promote group membership in the classroom, and then talk about how those could be used in the context of a math class. And then, as with every session, this is a really good spot at the end of a training to give some space for reflection and have people process what in this training, what have we talked about today stood out for you, what was surprising, what increased your knowledge, what changed your thinking, and then give people some time and space to talk about what of what we've covered today is something that you're going to take home and apply in your work and in your classroom. All right, we are coming up on 4:30 by my watch, so I want to wrap up here. I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping before I say goodbye. I want to let you know that per your feedback on the previous sessions, we are hard at work on revising the materials, and as I mentioned earlier, we will share out those revised materials with you at the end of this session. So some things we've heard from you that would make these more user-friendly is in those facilitators guides to go slide by slide, so that it's easier to work between the facilitator guide and the slides. So we are making that change and putting the slide numbers in. We will also be looking at all the feedback forms you've given us for other tips and ways we can make this more user-friendly. So with that in mind, I hope that you will keep an eye out for the feedback survey I will email out today after this session. And the final reminder I wanted to give is that our final session in the training series, the fourth meeting, will be Thursday, March 15th at 3:30 p.m. That will be a webinar for everyone, and we will be talking about self-efficacy in math. That was a topic I think everyone at our kickoff meeting reported a lot of interest in, so we're really excited to share that with you. But let's see, I have covered all of this, and that looks like it for me, which is a good thing because the snow is starting to come down a little fast and furious outside, so I better hightail it home before my little Prius can't cut it anymore. Thanks for coming today, everybody. If you have any questions, as always, please get in touch. You have my email address. Otherwise, look for the feedback form, and I will look forward to seeing you all in March for the last session.